I want to start in the post-World War II era.
From 1941 to 1953, Iran is relatively a democracy.
The election of Mohammad Mossadegh, what were his political philosophies?
Part of this generation of people who fought for Iranian sovereignty. The joke was that, the Iran provides the oil and the Anglo takes it, right?
But things are going so well under the Shah. How do we get to a revolution?
Revolutions don't usually occur because things are so bad.
Welcome to the World and Stuff podcast. Today we're going to talk about Iran with Arash Azizi. Super excited for this conversation. First, if you could just help our listeners understand why they should listen to you.
Well, I'm not sure they should, but so my name is Arash. I'm from Iran originally, and I would say I've always been interested in Iran, and I have a PhD in history and Middle East studies, so I've sort of dedicated much of my life to studying it, and I'm now a contributing writer for The Atlantic, and I've written a couple of books about Iran. So I guess, I think a lot about Iran and the region, and when you spend so much time thinking and writing about something, you might have a couple of things to say, but yeah, we'll find out.
So I want to start in kind of the post-World War II era. Obviously, Iran and Persia is an ancient land and has history. We could talk probably for the next 2 weeks about the history of this region, but let's start post-World War II, because I think that's like when things got sent on the trajectory that maybe is most applicable to modern times. During World War II, Iran is occupied by the Allied powers, and that brings about, as I understand, some changes to the way society functions, some more freedom of the press and openness that kind of paves the way for the next turn. Can you just talk about like the impact of British and Soviet occupation of Iran?
It's a very good question, and it's kind of a point of conflict actually when we talk about it in Iran. So what happened was that Iran had a modernizing monarch under Reza Shah. In the 1930s, he had founded a new monarchy, and he sort of led the independent Iranian policy. I'm annoyed when sometimes he's described as being a little like friendly to the Nazis. It's not really true. Iran had good relations with Germany and the Soviet Union as the two major sort of revisionist European powers.
He didn't cut those ties, was the complaint of the Allies, right?
Exactly. And Iran had good relations with Germany before the Nazis come into power. After the Nazis come into power, like many other countries, including the United States itself, which had relations, diplomatic relations with Germany, so did Iran. But at any rate, in 1941, the Allied, the England and Soviet Union, and later on United States, which enters the war after Pearl Harbor, of course, right? So a few months later. So in the summer of 1941, they invade Iran. And what happens here is something interesting. I'm very proud of this period of Iranian history. And the reason I'm proud of it is that Iran becomes what many people there call a bridge of victory. Iran is a majority of the aid that, as you know, the key to Second World War is United States getting aid to the Soviet Union, right? So it can fight the Nazis. Well, how does it do that? Majority of this aid actually goes through Iran. And also the end of Reza Shah's government means that there is a period, his son, his very young son, who was much younger than I am now, is put on the throne. This is the guy we visually know as the Shah, right? Because he later on becomes an important king. Shah is just Persian for king, right? Mm-hmm. But he becomes the Shah. Period of openness begins. So this is from 1941 to 1953. Iran is relatively a democracy. There's an elected parliament. There's a vibrant scene of intellectual and media production and all these newspapers and different political parties. And the governments are elected by the parliament. So it's a short period of experimentation with democracy. And as I said, Iran has a key role in the Second World War. The first time the big three, right? So Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, the first time they ever meet is in Tehran in November 1943. And it's very important that they guarantee Iranian sovereignty in this trip. So Iran is one of the only countries in world history that's never been colonized, right? And this is an important moment that they recognize Iranian sovereignty, which means when the United Nations is founded in 1945, the first thing ever, Security Council, the first resolution it ever gives, I think it's the second ever resolution. The first one is just sort of procedural. The second one ever is a call for Soviet forces to leave Iran after the Second World War, which President Truman sort of pushes that through the Security Council. So Iran is sort of has a pivotal role in this period of world history that many don't know. And as you said yourself, it's a period of democracy that unfortunately comes to an end in 1953.
Could you just give people a glimpse of like what Iran looked like pre-World War II, and so far as like the way it treated women and these type of issues?
Yeah, so Iran, like many other countries, in the region and beyond, what happens in the beginning of the 20th century is it's sort of, there's a long attempt for countries of the region and non-European countries to deal with their, what they would call backwardness, right? The idea that they are, they're left behind the European development. And they're trying different strategies to counteract that. And one very common strategy is that, well, we need to bring rule of law. We need to bring sort of the fruits of enlightenment, if you will. And this leads to a very important revolution in Iran in 1905, 1906. So feminist movement in Iran is really rooted. I mean, already you can see in the 1905, 1906 movement, there's a very vibrant feminist movement in Iran. And a feminist movement, not only women are fighting for women's rights and suffrage, they're fighting for political participation. There's a sort of a great statement by a women's association at the time, which says, sort of addressing the men. It says, well, if the men are not able to fight what was Ottoman occupation of Iran at the time, we'll get our guns and we'll throw them out. So this is sort of the situation. So there's a very long pedigree of feminist activity in Iran. It had continued. In 1941, when the space opens up, there are tons of women, workers, journalists, free thinkers of a variety of types who come and organize themselves. So it's a very vibrant scene in that way.
Let's talk about after World War II. You talked about the liberalization and democratization, and then we start the Cold War. And in many ways, like, Iran is the kind of the foundation for where this conflict starts to play out. It's all three powers are there. The Soviets don't want to leave, and we start to move into this era of world history where it's like almost everything is viewed in a Cold War context. Can you just describe how that starts to impact Iranian politics?
Sure. I'm a sort of Cold War historian, and I like using the prism of the Cold War. I like to extend it, and so I definitely agree with you that that's how the world politics comes organized around this principle. So when we think about what Cold War is really about, it's a competition about what will the future of the world be. Will it be communist or will it be capitalist after the Second World War? Now, this competition has started in a way earlier, right? You can even take it to the rise of the socialist movement in the 19th century, the building of the first communist state in 1917 in Russia. But during the Second World War, there's a truce, if you will, an alliance where capitalist countries and communist, the world communist movement, which included mass communist parties around the world, they come together to defeat Nazism. In a way, it's an important alliance that saves human civilization from the scourge of Nazism. And Eric Hobsbawm, British historian, calls it the Grand Alliance. It was the first big scene of it, as I said, was in Tehran in November 1943 when the big three come together. But after the Second World War, it's clear that these two are going to have very different visions for the future of humanity. And importantly, in my work as a Cold War historian, I try to sort of insist on the fact that Cold War is actually not about United States versus the Soviet Union. It's about a worldwide communist movement and a worldwide attempt to defeat it and to sort of preserve the capitalism as a mode of production. So that's why, of course, there are many Americans who are communist. The American Communist Party is very powerful. At some point, it may be about 50% of trade union leadership in this country was linked to the Communist Party. Hollywood, of course, right? Marilyn Monroe was famously a communist, and many others. So the point that it was really a global struggle. And when it comes to Iran, it's the same thing. That Iran has a very powerful communist party. It's founded in 1941. It's called Tudeh, which means the masses. And this communist party includes tens of thousands of workers. It's the first Iranian party that really accepts non-Muslims, right? So it's a very important Jewish component, for example. Mm-hmm. Now, Jewish people are members of communist parties in many countries, usually for the reason that, the mainstream parties have excluded them. The same is true in Iran. Other non-Muslim minorities like Assyrians, sort of Iranian Christians, Armenians are big in the Communist Party. Women, right? It's one of the first organizations that actually accepts women as members. So many women are in the Communist Party. And At the same time, of course, there are those who are very wary of the Soviet Union, which for Iranians is not just an abstract threat, is a northern superpower, which as Russia has always been the big bad neighbor of Iran, has sort of occupied large parts of Iran throughout our history. And under Stalin, it continues to sort of be like that, and it helps occupy parts of Iran in 1945. This is a controversial period because there are a couple of autonomous ethnic republics by Kurds and Azeris that are built by the support of the Soviet Red Army for about a year. At any rate, so this is sort of a struggle in Iran. There's a communist movement that has sympathy with the Soviet Union, a sympathy that was online with the Allied during the war, right? So the Communist Party gains tons of members after the Battle of Stalingrad. And so everybody's on the same side, if you will, like Americans, British. But after the war, it's going to be different for those who continue to advocate for communism and those who are very rightly afraid of the country becoming subsumed under the Soviet Union.
The election of Mohammad Mossadegh and the fear that develops in the West, I mean, I think a lot of it's founded in the nationalization of the oil reserves. What were his political philosophies? Was there any legitimate fear on behalf of Western powers that he was close with the Soviets and would aid them in this coming Cold War struggle?
Mossadegh was definitely not close to the Soviets. I would argue he was much more pro-American. I mean, he was anti-communist in many ways. Mossadegh was a Iranian nationalist. But what do we mean by that, right? This word gets bandied about. I mentioned earlier that Iran is one of the only countries in the world history that is not colonized, right? And Israel is like maybe 5 or 6 countries outside Europe and Americas that's never been colonized, right? And Iran is one of them. But Iran, like other sort of colonized countries, is really occupied and really surrounded by European countries, right? So to our east, British, right, which controlled India, Russia to the north. Then French have a sort of a very important influence in the Levant, right? So Mossadegh is part of this generation of people who fought for Iranian sovereignty. It's a very important thing to sort of realize. For Iran to be able to keep its sovereignty, to not fall to European colonization, is a very important achievement, an important quest, if you will. So Mossadegh is primarily that, right? And in a way, he's a precursor of the non-aligned movement. He's a precursor of Afro-Asiatic movement, right, which later on becomes an important theme of the post-war history. So his quest is to keep Iran sovereign. And I have to say that later on, I believe this is also the quest of the Shah. So the kind of conflict that they have is sort of tragedy of Iranian history in a way. Now, what do you do if you want to keep Iranian sovereignty? In 1951, which is when Mossadegh comes to power, well, he helps nationalize the oil industry, right? Which at the time was heavily controlled by the British. Right. This is also a bit tragic because, of course, today the fact that every country controls its own oil resources is just a given. And in fact, not long after, this becomes a given. But at the time, this wasn't the case. Our oil in Iran was controlled by the British, running through what they call the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The joke was that, the Iran provides the oil and the Anglo takes it, right? So that was the relationship. They sold it with whatever, and the British were very open that this was economically beneficial to them. It's funny because Britain actually has a socialist government at the time, like a Labour Party government. And Labour Party says, if we want to pay for our expensive social program at home, we're going to need the Iranian oil. And Mossadegh fights against this.
Is there an argument to be made that the British, we developed these oil fields and now you're kind of cutting us out after we put in all this work and our companies were so involved?
Well, the thing is, Mossadegh didn't want to cut them out necessarily, right? It would be happy to work out a plan for them. But of course, if you look at then the history of Iranian oil industry, it was very clear that Britain had definitely, taken much more than it had put in. Also, Mossadegh would have been happy he wanted the British managers to remain, to get paid. I mean, like how it is today around the world, oil companies continue to operate around the world, and they don't do it for, they don't do it for charity, right? So they get paid, right? But the idea was that Iran should control its own oil, right? That they needed to control its own oil, and also there was a treaty before. Mossadegh was happy to renegotiate it, right? So it wasn't just a matter of kicking the British out. It was a matter of trying to control it. And on the other side, and the oil industry was also really organized around effectively racist lines. I mean, the management was British, then there were sort of skilled Indian workers who were second, and the Iranians who on the management level also got paid a lot less. So it was. It was really a national quest, as I said, for Iran to be able to control its own oil. And the other thing I should say is that Mossadegh, like many others, had his hope in one country, in a country that he thought is by definition anti-colonial. It was founded by an anti-colonial revolution, that it has no history of colonialism in Iran, that in fact it has a history of opposing European colonial in Iran. And which country is that? That's of course the United States, right? So when Mossadegh visits the United States to speak at the United Nations, he goes to Pennsylvania and he sort of sees the Liberty Bell, and he sort of gives all, he really has hopes in the United States. There's a period in which many people around the world think that the United States can choose the side of, if you will, independence of former colonies as opposed to colonialism. But of course, that's not sort of, and it kind of arguably does that in Indonesia, for example, right? The United States does not take the side of the Dutch. It supports the Indonesian independence movement. So these hopes are not totally unfounded. And Mossadegh is no friends of communism. Americans, because we have all the diplomatic archives, Americans know Mossadegh is not communist. They know he's not pro-Soviet. Their fear isn't that he is a communist. Their fear of some is that, we will argue whether this is a real fear or not. As in, if they're honest that they're actually fearful about this or not. But the idea is that Mossadegh will be too weak, that he can be overthrown and the Communist Party can come to power, because it was a very powerful Communist Party, as I said. So it's not that he himself is communist, but that he's weak and he can be overthrown by the communists. And in that case, the Soviet Union will have control of, Iranian oil, and that would be, really bad for the world capitalist order.
What follows this is, I would say, one of the more ugly episodes of American history. Eisenhower was president. He was more of a fan of these clandestine operations to try to impose the United States' will around the world, the British as well. Tell us what happened.
In 1953, Britain and the United States decide to overthrow the democratically elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh via a covert operation. The British are in the lead in some ways, but the CIA has a very important role, and they help stage a coup in Iran. They work with certain elements in Iran. They had been working with certain elements throughout the Mossadegh period, right? This is an era in which CIA is trying to do anti-communist covert operations around the world, right? So CIA helps the Italian Christian Democrats to defeat communists politically in Italy, for example, right? It helps them in a variety of ways. It's kind of and you have to remember, CIA is just founded, by the way, right? United States traditionally didn't have an intelligence organization. FBI, did the foreign intelligence work. It's funny to remember that, given like how sort of powerful CIA becomes, but it's a very newly founded organization. At a time, the British are the sort of big brother, and they're teaching it what to do. But in 1953, it helps stage a coup in Iran that overthrows Mossadegh. Gives most of the power to the Shah, the very young Shah.
He had just left and he came right back.
Exactly. Yeah. So what happens is that, Shah likes to leave, as we found out in Iranian history always. In, I think it would be like 15th, 16th of August, that is the first attempt of the coup. Shah runs away to Baghdad. The poor Iranian ambassador in Baghdad is told by the foreign ministry to not receive Shah because he's no longer going to be in power, and he doesn't. He pays for that decision dearly, of course, because the Shah is going to be back in power for 3 days later. But so he first goes to Iraq, then he goes to Italy. Conversely, there's an Iranian guy in Italy. He says, basically, I'll fund you for the rest of your life. He benefits from that later on. Anyway, so he goes to Iraq and in Italy for a couple of days. But while the first coup fails, the second coup, which is just 3 days later, and there's a lot of sort of stories and mythologies around this, and what happens after the first coup fails, and how is it that the Americans try to do it again. But at any rate, the second coup is successful. Mossadegh is overthrown. He's court-martialed, sentenced to house arrest. There's been some attempts to recast this event, but let's be very clear about some things that are just facts, right? So Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh was elected by the Iranian parliament, which was relatively freely elected. This is the last time in history, to this day, that Iran had a head of government that was elected in a fashion, right? Now, he wasn't directly elected, of course, that's why it causes confusion, but it was elected by an elected parliament, right? And that's a fact, right? We don't have that after. None of the prime ministers of the Shah are elected by the parliament after that. And the second fact is that, this isn't just a nice little coup. I mean, the foreign minister, Fatemi, is executed, of course. Dozens, in fact, hundreds, I would say, of our socialist activists are arrested and executed. Newspapers are closed down. It's to this day the last time we had a free press. We've never really had a free press after 1953 to this day. So it's and the United States has accepted its responsibility, and Madeleine Albright, of course, did so. Barack Obama did later. And in fact, very recently, CIA in an internal podcast that, believe it or not, CIA also has a podcast, and there they admit that while many covert operations of the CIA, they argue that perhaps many of them are, on the side of democracy in a fashion or not. In 1953, it's a indubitably anti-democratic coup that comes to really shape Iranian politics.
The return of the Shah. What is that period like? I find it so interesting because I have an Iranian friend who lives here. She kind of has this nostalgia for that period of time, considering what happens after that. So what is that? I guess it's like until the revolution, like almost 30 years of time under the Shah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's hard not to have nostalgia. I should begin saying that. And let me also just mention a fact here. The 1953 coup is very important, as I said, but the Islamic Republic of Iran, that is, of course, comes to power in 1979, tries to sort of claim that this is why it sort of hates the United States. That's a lot of ballooning for a couple of basic reasons. Number one, the Islamist elements in Iran are pro-coup in 1953. They're against Mossadegh. They're against the communists, and they're against Mossadegh, and they support the coup. The most important cleric who the Islamic Republic sees as its intellectual ancestor, Ayatollah Khomeini, he supports the U.S. staged coup in 1953, right? So it's very important to remember that. And they oppose Mossadegh, as I said, and because this is sort of the politics of Iran at the time. The left, broadly speaking, left of Mossadegh, it's sort of trying to progress Iran on democratic lines, and the clerics don't. So that's one important thing to remember. The other thing is that, of course, they hate the United States for more intrinsic reasons, right? So it's not an honest account that, they hate the United States because of 1953, and this leads to suspicion or stuff like that. They use it sometimes, but it's not really true. Now, how was the rule of Shah? Well, we can talk about it. It's a long time from 1953 to 1979. Sure. But I'll mention a couple of things. Number one, it's hard not to have nostalgia for it. It's hard not to have nostalgia for it because of how bad things are after it comes, after 1979. Now, I'd say I also have nostalgia, like not personal nostalgia, obviously I wasn't there, but for pre-1953, when we had, as I said, I would have liked to see Iran in which we have democratic elections and free press and all that. But during this period, I mean, it's a very long period, as I said, but a couple of things that Shah does are hard not to sort of like, frankly. In the 1960s, he engages in what is called the White Revolution. And the White Revolution includes a series of reforms that are basically what the communists and the National Front, which was the party of Mohammad Mossadegh, advocated. He takes their program and does it, right? There is a precedence in this in history, of course, right? Famously, Bismarck, the Prussian chancellor, affects a lot of social democratic programs in order to counteract their popularity. So the Shah here, what are some of the reforms he does? Land reform, very important. The land reform that Shah does is much more extensive than someone like Gamal Abdel Nasser, the socialist, loud president of Egypt, for example. Women's suffrage, he gives the right of vote to women. Since elections are effectively meaningless, this is not huge perhaps, but it does mean also it's not just the right of the vote. Pushed by the Iranian feminists, Iran adopts many progressive laws when it comes to women's rights, progressive family laws, it gives right of divorce to women. There are Iranian female judges, female cabinet ministers, female ambassadors, right? These are huge for that era. Also, Iran goes through a astronomical economic growth. It's like an economic miracle. And Iran sort of has double-digit economic growth for a period. As I said, social restrictions are really sort of limited in a sort of unprecedented manner. So again, non-Muslim minorities in Iran, Baha'is, Jews, Christians, are able to have certain freedoms and social rights that was rare in many Muslim countries in that era. So it's hard not to look with some sympathy on it, especially because after 1979, of course, our country becomes victim of a revolutionary republic that, in order to attain its sort of ideological vision, in many ways sacrifices Iran. Although, if one is to be fair, of course, not everything that happens in 1979 is dark. There are things that happen under Islamic Republic that that are also positive. But by and large, I think it's a very dark period in Iranian history. So, of course, we'll be a bit nostalgic for pre-1979 Iran.
So things are going so well under the Shah. How do we get to a revolution?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Well, let me start by saying this. Revolutions don't usually occur because things are so bad. Revolutions like that things are just like absolute rock bottom, or that there's so much poverty. If that was the case, very poor countries should have eternal revolutions, but they don't, right? The revolutions usually occur where people's expectations are, rise, but they're not fulfilled. So that's, in my opinion, what best explains the Iranian Revolution. Imagine you're a young Iranian middle-class man or woman in the 60s and 70s, right? More like 70s in Iran, in the early 1970s. You can travel to Europe. The living standards of some of the Iranian middle classes are not that different from Europe in that era. You can work with a lot of companies around the world. Iran, by the way, Iran had good relations not just with the West, but also with Soviet Union, with China, with all Eastern Bloc countries. So you have really grown, right? A country, you have to remember, let me just tell you a very brief story of Iranian Prime Minister Amir Abbas Hoveyda, who was a prime minister for 12 years in this period, to portray this sort of new sense of Iranian confidence. Hoveyda remembers that when he worked, during the 40s, when he was sort of an Iranian diplomat, Iranian diplomats would hardly get invited to parties that the French embassy would throw in Iran. And that only maybe some diplomats would get, and they were vying for this invitation to a party, and which was sort of humiliating, right? And Hoveyda remembers later when he's prime minister of Iran and he's visiting France, and the French prime minister asks to have a meeting for lunch, and Hoveyda says, I just wanted to sort of make a point, and he says, I'm busy, sorry, I don't think I can make time for lunch with you, right? So it really shows you how much Iran had come forward. Now, so Iranians have this confidence, have this, they've experienced this economic growth, but politically, they have nowhere to go. I.e., the Shah is an autocrat. He controls all powers in his own hands. In 1975, he makes Iran a one-party state. Everybody has to join this party, which he calls the Rastakhiz, or the sort of Renaissance party, that everyone has to join. And that's not going to be, you cannot be someone who has achieved all this, growth, but also has no say. So it's a mismatch between, to use sort of political science lingo, it's a mismatch between economic and political development. And added to that, the other thing we have to remember, so that's one thing, and the second thing I'd say is that we have to remember this is a very rebellious era. This is 1960s and 70s. Mm-hmm. Everyone everywhere is rising, right? Mm-hmm. It's the era of hippies in the United States and the student movement, and everywhere in the world, right? There's nowhere in the world in late 1960s and early 70s when you don't have some sort of a revolutionary experimentation. Unfortunately, for our case, one of these revolutionary experiments actually comes to power. And it turns out this idea that let's just smash everything and hope something better arises doesn't always work. So, how is it that out of that, a theocratic conservative regime like led by Ayatollah Khomeini comes to power? It's an interesting point. But the reasons for discontent are the sort of two men that I mentioned.
Because I don't imagine the people that were traveling to Europe and meeting with French diplomats and clamoring for more political freedoms had a Islamic theocracy in mind when they were pushing for these changes.
No, it's fascinating. No, they didn't, right? And Khomeini, and Khomeini doesn't come to power clamoring for a theocracy in many ways either. Now, this is a contentious part of Iranian history. You know, I was just was talking about it over dinner last night. You know, Khomeini is, if you listen to Khomeini, it's very clear that he wants Islamic theocracy. He says it, right? He says he wants the rule of Islam. Now, one advantage he has is that no one really knows what it means. Like, I mean, what is the Islamic Republic? It doesn't exist, right? There is, and you know, really, 1979, some historians compare it with the rule of Jean Calvin in 16th century in Geneva. That was the last time priests really ruled things. Like, what is priestly rule? It's kind of inconceivable for many. So what happens is that, so no, that's not the direction, right? What the direction of different political movements in Iran is, yes, it's anti-Westernism, but not in the direction of theocracy. It's anti-Westernism just the way it was in the socialist movements around the world. The idea is that Iran should not be so close to the United States, and thus also it should have more political freedoms. A lot of these people don't support, you know, they're not exactly liberals. So it's kind of, when they say political freedoms, you can also second out them. But how does Khomeini come out of this? The longest story short of it is there is an Islamist movement, right? There is an Islamist movement who wants to experiment and build a new Islamic republic, whatever that is, right? And that itself has many different forms and different sort of ideas about it. But how Khomeini comes to lead, you know, the longest story short of it is that Khomeini is very charismatic and he's able to carry a lot of people. And, you know, part of his charm is this ambiguity, actually, right? So he's able, you know, people are able to put their hopes in him without knowing exactly what they're going to get at the other end, right? So he seems to be, you know, an example of piety, of post-partisanship. And others think they can use him. That's the other thing. Other political figures, they say he's a cleric, he's some old guy. He's not going to be able, he's not the one who's going to run things, right? I think if you asked people who were around Khomeini, all these young students, westernized, you know, educated people, like they're people who, usually they got their degrees from Texas or Berkeley or Paris. Or, they thought, you know, they would say, what, do you think clerics are going to come and build a new estate and run things? No, it would be us who will be running the shots. And for a very brief period, that is the case, by the way, right? In 1979, the first government is formed by a bunch of, you know, people with suits and ties. But Khomeini and the clerics around him do the inconceivable. They're able to marginalize them, remove them from power, and concentrate power in their hands and go on to build a new experiment in world history, if you will, this strange regime of Islamic Republic. That's how
it strikes me, and I'd be interested in your take on this, but I think we've seen this in other places around the world, is like when there's a power vacuum and you know, on one side you might have a conglomeration of quote unquote liberal forces who some people want more press freedom and some people want political parties, and it's not as organized, often younger and you know, revolutionary, whereas you have forces of the church that already have kind of this hierarchical society where you have the leadership and you have clergy and you have all the way down to like individual churches where, you know, you kind of already have like almost a government in waiting. So in a power vacuum, they're going to have an advantage when you know, people are vying to take over leadership. I wonder if you think that's true.
That's really what happened with Iran. Now, this is the point of a power vacuum, right? History is contingent. You know, there is a political vacuum, different people walk in, they end up determining the kind of political order, right? If you think about it, like the American Revolution, right, these forces that are, you know, the founding fathers, end up writing Articles of Confederation. That doesn't quite work out. Then they end up writing the Constitution. It's a very small number of people devise this form of government that then rules over lives for a very long time, right? Now, if they happen to not been into democracy, things would have gone so different. Actually, even if you look at the struggles of early American Republic, if Alexander Hamilton had got his way, perhaps the United States could have become a monarchy, and God knows, you know, what we'll be talking about today, right? So the same in Iran, a very small number of people are able to win the political battle, and battle in politics is won in contingent way. You know what I mean? When I say contingent way for the listeners, I mean that it wasn't predetermined. It's not sort of some grand structural reason. It's just these are the guys who are able to win politically. And you win politically not with arguments, right? You win by being better politically organized. Now, what you said is absolutely true. The advantage of Khomeini was that the clerics existed on a large degree, right? All over Iran, there were clerics. And while the Shah had oppressed communists, had oppressed all independent political associations, but he couldn't oppress the clerics. Sure, many clerics went to jail, right? Many of them were sort of experienced jail during the Shah's time. But you can never just extinguish all clerics. And because there were so many clerics who were pro-Islamist and who were pro-Khomeini, especially after 79. Before 79, a lot of them are not, right? Because they're afraid of power. A lot of, a very fun thing in Iranian politics is when someone speaks so revolutionary, you find a picture of them kissing the hands of the queen, right? You can usually find one for many of them. But at any rate, Khomeini now has has a network he can use. But I think the surprising fact for many is that they just didn't expect this bunch of clerics will be able to take over power in a country like Iran. And build their own judiciary and build their own military, right? Build their own institutions. But that's precisely what they end up doing.
It's not long after that before war breaks out, and I feel like the Iran-Iraq War is not something that's widely understood by people in the United States and maybe other countries as well, and the impact that had on both those countries. The genesis of the Iran-Iraq War, can you just explain a little bit about what happened and how it got started?
So in February 1979, Khomeini comes to power in Iran. The Islamic Republic is founded. As it goes through a big sort of tumult, right? Now, very brief introduction of the region at the time. So Iran is one of the only countries that is Shia majority. So Islam is divided to two grand denominations, Shia and Sunni, right? So only about 15% of the world Muslims are Shia, but Iran is one of the only countries, one of 3 or 4 countries, which is majority Shia. Now, another majority Shia country is Iraq. Although while Iran is like 90%, more than 90% Shia, Iraq is very slight. Maybe it's like 55%, 60% at most Shia. But at the time, Iraq is ruled by a brutal dictator, Saddam Hussein, who is Sunni and he used to have what I would call an Arab nationalist socialist ideology, right? The Ba'ath Party.
Yeah.
Exactly. But by the time of the revolution, he has become, and Saddam Hussein becomes president in 1979 also, actually, even though he was a very powerful vice president before that. So he already controlled power, since 1968 mostly. But 1979, the backer, the president dies, he becomes president of Iraq. And he has effectively, limited power to himself and his almost clan, basically, in northern Iraq. So the Shia are really excluded and oppressed in Iraq as well. And Saddam Hussein has a worry that now that there is this revolution in Iran, there is tumult everywhere in the region, and he has very good reason to worry. And Khomeini also does actually sort of provoke the Iraqi Shia, sort of calls on them at some point to rise against Saddam. Saddam at some point kills a very grand Shia in Iraq, Sadr, right? So he executed him and his sister, early on, shortly after the Iranian Revolution. So in September 1980, Saddam Hussein decides to invade Iran. In this sort of a very controversial act, he invades Iran. He invades a large part of Iran. And now this is the best gift for the Islamic Republic in many ways. Now Iranians, as I'm sure you can ask, your friend, are pretty patriotic people, like most people. I mean, I think any country in the world, if they invade part of your country, you're gonna show a reaction. But now Iranians across all different ideas come to defend their country. The Shah era pilots who were Iranian jails at the time, many of them are executed by the brutal Islamic Republic, right? But many of them who are in prison, come out to fly sorties and fight against the Iraqi invaders, Iranian communists, Iranian socialists, nationalists. No matter what your belief is, you join in the army and you're trying to kick out the invaders. The Islamic Republic will use this, though, to consolidate itself. War is usually a great opportunity. And they do so in a variety of ways. For example, a militia called Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, or IRGC, as it will become known. Notice that it doesn't include the name Iran in it, and that's not accidental. It's supposed to be a transnational sort of Islamist militia. They found because they don't trust the Iranian army, they don't trust institutions, so they found this under the leadership of Khomeini. and IRGC will use the war to expand, its control and effectively takes over the Iranian military. And while Iranians are able to kick Iraqis out of Iranian territory by 1983, and they liberate all Iranian territory, it would have been a good time to make peace. Many people are pushing for Khomeini to make peace, but Khomeini knows the longer he continues the war, the more he can consolidate the Islamic Republic. So the war goes on until 1988. Iran is not able, the goal of Khomeini had been to overthrow Saddam, and he famously says the path to Jerusalem goes through Karbala. The idea is that this new regime is also very anti-Israel, of course, will invade Iraq and then go on to Israel and do all sorts of things, is not really able to even really control 1 inch of Iraqi territory for a very long time, and has to, in 1988, it has to accept the peace degree. Because I mentioned Israel, I should also say an interesting fact that Israel actually helps Iran in this war with Iraq. Both Iran and Iraq now are grand foes of Israel, so sort of it's not, but Iraq more, right? Takes Iraq. Saddam was effectively the most important anti-Israel leader of the time in the region, in the Arab world. So Israel secretly, with the United States, helps the Iranian military, whereas Palestinian Liberation Organization supports Iraq as part of its Arabist sort of ideology. It supports Iraq in this war. So that's also complicates Iran's attitude to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yeah, Donald Rumsfeld went and met with Saddam Hussein. There's a famous picture that you frequently see.
That's
Do you
right,
think that also, I mean, what happened in 1953, the U.S. taking the side of Iraq in the Iran-Iraq War, the mistrust that may be present in Iranian society, that's part of it, even today?
Well, number one, I don't think really Iraq takes this. The United States takes the side of the Iraq. It's true that Rumsfeld does at some point, but if you look at the, I just said that Israel also helped Iran, helped by the U.S. Right? After all, it's also it's the era when Iran-Contra affair happens, right? So the Reagan administration is of a couple of minds. And this is a very long war, right? So from 80 to 88, a lot of things happen. But I would say the United States definitely doesn't consistently support Iraq. At some point, it comes to support Iraq a bit. It sells arms to Iraq, and it definitely doesn't support Iran, right? But when it comes to sort of suspicion, I mean, I don't think the average the Iranian public does not harbor anti-American sentiments. I really believe that. I mean, there is no evidence that it does. In fact, it's probably one of the more pro-American sort of sentiments anywhere in the Middle East. Not because not because Iranians are just like pro-Western, quote unquote, as is sometimes said, but they're more pro-Western than they support the alternative, as in sort of the authoritarian axis of Russia and China. So that's what that's what I say. And for the Islamists that are in power, they hate the West and what it represents, sort of fundamentally. So they don't need these reasons. Although I should say also, this is a complicated matter, right? So when I say the Islamists in power, I mean Ayatollah Khomeini, the supreme leader, and sort of his hardliners. But there is a very big chunk of 79 revolutionaries, right, including the Islamist ones who are in power, who've long given up on that, and who now understand that it's kind of foolish to build an identity around hating the United States or opposing it, and that they want good ties with the United States, and they want, we're going to a multipolar world. They want for Iran what every country would want for them. They want Iran to be a strong country so that it can have equal relations with both the U.S. And the others. And then there's further other chunk of people, including some in the establishment, who are just outright pro-Western. I mean, some of them are actual liberal Democrats. Those who are not liberal Democrats, they basically believe, for a variety of reasons, that it makes sense more for Iran to be aligned generally with the West than the alternative. It's interesting. It goes to Iran. There are reasons for it, right? Because Russia, I mean, I told you earlier, we have very good reasons not to trust Russia or be happy about that relationship, right? Same in regards to China. I mean, a lot of people are not happy with that. So, yeah, I wouldn't say Iranian public has the Iranian public certainly doesn't have an anti-Western animus. You
mentioned the Iranian theocracy's opposition to Sunni monarchs in Iraq, but it wasn't just Iraq, and the opposition to other Sunni monarchs kind of sets the stage for this Shia-Sunni rivalry that kind of permeates much of the Middle East today. Can you just talk about the foundations of that and implications for that now?
It's an interesting question. I don't actually believe that the Islamic Republic founders, Khomeini and them, were sectarian, as in they were anti-Sunni, pro-Shia. Partly because this would have been too small for them, by which I mean, if being anti-Sunni, pro-Shia means that you want to rule over 50, you want to sort of command the loyalty of 15% of the Muslim world, that's sort of a paltry deal if your claim is actually that you want to lead the world's Muslims. In fact, you want to lead the world's oppressed. It's sort of the term they use, right? They sort of start giving different sort of rhetorical support early on to the Irish Republican Army, to the Black Panther Party, right? They say that they sort of represent the world oppressed, and that's sort of the claims that they want to have. So they're not sectarians in this way. Their opposition to Sunni monarchs in the region comes from this revolutionary idea, right? That they are pro-Western monarchs, right? And that they should instead be, Islamist governments that are anti-Western, right? So they're too secular for them and they're too pro-Western for them. That's really their qualm with them. And of course, Khomeini was, for example, the time he would refuse to even to acknowledge Saudi Arabia. He would call it the land of Hejaz, which is sort of a traditional name for it, right? It's very interesting. It would be good, if any aspiring PhD student, someone listening, I think it would be a good sort of PhD dissertation to look at sort of Khomeini's ideas about Saudi Arabia from even before that, right? He has this anti-Wahhabi ideas for a very long time. Wahhabism being sort of one of the ideologies in Saudi Arabia. At any rate, so that's sort of the story. But look, let's look at it this way, right? To also understand the region today. What really happens is that this Islamic Republic, which is a revolutionary state, which has an anti-Western ideology, which has an anti-monarchical ideology, becomes a vector of instability in its region, that it effectively threatens the stability of every country in the region. Also partially because, so I mentioned, what I mentioned, so anti-Westernism, right? Islamism versus the sort of secularism that is dominant in many of these countries, monarchism, right? So revolutionary. And also Israel becomes important here because the Islamic Republic finds itself as anti-Israel, definitely also anti-Semitic, right? But anti-Israel. But at a time when the Arab world has just finished, in effect, the Arab-Israeli war has effectively finished. Of course, Palestinian-Israeli conflict hasn't finished, but Arab, as in the Arab countries, right? So in 1978, the Camp David Agreement, President Carter signs it with Menachem Begin, Prime Minister of Israel, and Anwar Sadat, President of Egypt. 1979, Egypt and Israel sign a peace treaty. So just when the leading Arab state effectively declares peace with Israel, now there are other claimants, right? So as a result of this, Egypt gets kicked out of the Arab League, right? The Arab League's headquarters was in Cairo. It's moved to Tunisia. And so sort of that happens in 79, but that's like 10 years later, Egypt comes back to the Arab League. The headquarters moves back to Cairo. The Arab League gives up on the type of a struggle it had against Israel. Those who are still anti-Israel is Saddam. He's going to be overthrown, but even before he's overthrown, there's not much he can do against Israel. Same in Syria, the Ba'ath Party there. Lots of wars against Israel, but no fighting because they know they can't do much, right? Syria especially because it has borders. So Iran inherits this mantle of anti-Israel rejectionism, if you will, this quest to destroy the Israeli state and destroy Israel. And this is going
for political reasons, or like what is how did the leadership in Iran at that time become so invested in the Palestinian cause, which is kind of seems like they wouldn't have direct ties, right? So they're mostly Sunni Muslims, and it doesn't seem like maybe a natural ally. I don't know.
Well, but that's why I'm telling you that I don't think they're sectarian, right? Mm-hmm. It's natural for them to support it because at the time, of course, number one, it's not unlike today, it's sort of the cause of the global left generally, right? Sure. Now, some sort of a struggle against Israeli occupation is. It's Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories, right? Its most extreme version of, we need to basically end Israel we have to be honest about things, right? The idea that Israel should be ended, that it's a sort of colonialist state that basically should be ended, whatever that means, right? It has obviously sort of genocidal tones against Israeli Jews. This is a very common idea at the time. It's the it's the actual position of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, right? The PLO. Now, there are many in the PLO who don't actually believe this, and they end up accepting Israel. In 1990s, right? You can already see from 1973, 1974, the moderates in the PLO have the leadership, and they know they want to make some sort of amends with Israel, some sort of amends, right? But the Palestinian National Charter still very clearly says all of this land, between river and the sea, belongs to Palestinians. It needs to be Arab state, and it very openly says, it says Jews who have come there after what is called the Zionist invasion, which really means 1880s. It basically means majority of Israeli Jews don't belong there, right? So it's not surprising that Iran would have followed the same line. It's just that it does it when others have given up on it. So if we look at ideology of the Islamic Republic as this anti-Western, revolutionary, anti-Israeli, anti-sort of Zionist of its time, it makes sense that they would have this goal. But it's one thing to just have the goal. It's something else to actually dedicate a lot of your country's resources to it. That's when it becomes interesting. Algeria technically has the same goal, right? But Algeria is not threatening itself and its national existence by arming a variety of militias in the region and sort of sending them on Israel, but Iran does.
Why is that? Can we talk a little about Iran and its proxies, Houthi rebels in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Hamas to a certain extent in the Palestinian territory? What kind of grand game do you see them playing with those proxies?
I mean, the IRGC, remember the militia that we talked about, obviously always has a global ambition in a way, definitely a pan-Islamic ambition, right? As I said, it's already visible in its name. The IRGC starts building up these militias in different countries from early on. The most successful one, if you were jewel in the crown of the IRGC's axis of resistance, is what they call it, is Hezbollah. This party that is this militia/political party that is built in Lebanon in 1980 out of the Shia minority in Lebanon. And this is a time where, Lebanon will soon be invaded by Israel, like in 1982, right? Israel invades Lebanon, and the start of Lebanon, Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon also happens together with some, gruesome crimes like the massacre of Sabra and Shatila. This is a massacre of Palestinian refugees that happens. The massacre is actually committed by Lebanese Christian militias, but Israel aids it effectively, as the Israeli authorities themselves find later, right? The Agranat Commission in Israel sort of concludes later that Israel had a role in this massacre. So Israel manages to turn Lebanese Shia, the Shia of the south of Lebanon, which were probably the least anti-Israel Arabs there was. It turns them into one of the most anti-Israel Arabs because they are fighting an Israeli occupation of their land. And Hezbollah grows out of this, right? Becomes a significant political force, aided by Iran, and they try to create these forces in other countries as well. So to answer your question as to what's the goal, I mean, the goal is the spread of Islamist ideology via the states. It's also via these militias. It's also to project the power of the Islamic Republic, and to do so, unfortunately, entails making these countries unstable. You see, here's one of the big contradictions of the Islamic Republic. What were the relationship between, let's say, Soviet Union and the Communist parties during the Cold War? But the Communist parties wanted to advance communism, right? And we discussed what that meant in the United States. The American Communist Party, right, would try to do, yes, sometimes they would spy for the Soviet Union, right? Which they considered to be for the good in the general scheme of things. But in the United States, they would fight politically. They would, sometimes support Democrats. But they wanted a socialist system. It was clear what it was, right? 1/3 of the world was run under this socialist system and authoritarian system, but nevertheless non-capitalist socialist. What is the end goal of Islamist ideology? Who wants to actually build an Islamic Republic in Iraq or Lebanon, or other countries? It's very hard to do that. One reason it's hard is that even though I said Islamic Republic is not necessarily sectarian, the actual model, the ruling model of the Islamic Republic is very closely tied to Shia rule. It's something that they call guardianship of the jurist. It owes much more to Plato's Republic than to any Islamic ideology. Basically, it's a supreme leader who has to be a jurist and who has to sort of be a wise man who rules over things. In some ways, also, it's the tradition of Iranian absolute monarchy, if you will, right? So it's not an exportable system. It's very hard because there are no other Shia majority countries, really. Like Iraq, as I told you, is maybe 55% Shia, right? So you can't convince others to live like that. Other Shia majority countries like Bahrain, it still has a very big Sunni minority and also a Sunni monarchy. Azerbaijan, it's Shia majority, but it's mostly secular, right? Because it's been ruled by Russia and later Soviet Union for like 200 years, right? So as a result, there's a sort of a contradiction that Iran has this generic, the Islamic Republic has this generic anti-oppression, as they call it, Islamist ideology, but it's not very easy to export it. And this is why what we've seen in the last few decades is a descent, if you will, into sectarianism. So if you don't have a universalist ideology that you can export, what you can do is try to arm these Shia militias and push them in a sort of a Shia versus Sunni. And in the last sort of 20 years or so, we had a period of sectarianization in the region. The conflict became about Shia versus Sunni. And this was on both sides, right? Because of the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 led to a lot of Sunni Islamist anti-Shia groups to grow in these countries, right? But I would say actually today is not very important. I would say that Shia versus Sunni today in 2024 is not a very important organizing principle. I'm happy we're having this conversation today because if you ask me this conversation as other sort of interviewers did back in the day, it would be very hard to argue that it's not important because it appeared to be very important. But look at the world today and tell me,
Back in the day, as in like in the heat of the Iraq war when it's splintering along sectarian lines?
Exactly. I would say 2007, 8, 12, 13, 14, 15, the heat of the Syrian civil war also, right? Syrian civil war seemed to have a very sectarian, dimension to it. And ISIS, right? The rise of ISIS in Iraq and Syria. But today, like the axis of resistance, some of its most important components are the Sunnis, right? Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It appears to be much more important who is anti-Israel, who is not so anti-Israel, than who is Sunni, who is Shia, right? So I think the sectarian lens has the way I usually talk about this is that, the sectarian identity matters, but its valence and its relevance changes. Just like there was a time, right? The United States has had 2 Catholic presidents in its history. When John F. Kennedy was getting elected, if you look at the sort of history, both his proponents and opponents would cite him being Catholic as a very important, it was a ballot question, right? When people are voting, they're thinking about the fact they're electing a Catholic president. Now, I think if you had a friend today who told you he's supporting or not supporting Joe Biden because he's a Catholic, you would probably laugh at them and think they're a weirdo, right? It's very unlikely to be an organizing principle for someone to hate or not hate Joe Biden. Now, the Catholic and Protestants are still here, but their relevance has changed. So there's the same thing with Shia and Sunni. Sometimes this division and this antagonism is very relevant, and sometimes less so.
Let's talk about Iran today and into the future. There was this young Kurdish girl that was killed when she was taken in by the Iranian security forces. It caused these massive demonstrations. And I felt, listening to speakers in DC and speaking with friends, that there was a lot of hope, I feel like, then for, radical change. But it seems like to have petered out, I guess. Well, how would you assess those protests and where we are now? I know there's been a huge crackdown. There's been all these executions happening in Iran.
Iranians have been fighting against the Islamic Republic for a very long time. In fact, if you look at Iranian history since late 1990s to now, Iranians have been trying to change this Iranians of my generation especially, and those after, they've been trying to change this oppressive regime that rules over their lives, that is one of the worst regimes in the world, one of the most anti-woman, one of the most repressive, one of the most murderous, that also has done us the added benefit of destroying our country's economy. So if you think about Iran today, Iran is in a worse shape today than in almost every single way. Economically is destroyed. politically is repressive. Internationally, it's isolated. So naturally, Iranians have been fighting against the Islamic Republic. Now, I say they've been fighting against the Islamic Republic. They've been fighting against this authoritarianism of it. And that has taken different shapes. It has taken very different shapes, right? Sometimes they would vote in elections that happened in the Islamic Republic, and they would vote for candidates that wanted to open up. And sometimes they would take part in mass street movements. In 2009 they did that, in 2017 they did that, in 2019 they did that, in 2020 they did that, and finally in 2022, following the killing of Mahsa Amini, a young Kurdish girl who was arrested, as you know, first because she wasn't covering her hair. Iran is the only country in the world which forces half of the society, a woman, to cover up their hair. No other Muslim country does that, with the exception of the Taliban regime, the unrecognized Taliban regime in Afghanistan, that they also do it. So the movement happened. Why there was a lot of hope? Well, the hopeful thing that exists is that I believe, I'm not a sugarcoating guy. I don't just say things because I like them to be true. I believe it is really true that about 85% of the Iranian society don't want the Islamic Republic, don't want the rule of Ayatollah Khomeini. It's not very hard to see why, because of all the reasons that I said, right? Imagine if Iran was a dictatorship, but our economy was doing well, or at least the economy was getting better. You could see why some people would be like, well, we can live with that, right? Some people being even including me, right? Yes, I would go and I would protest and I would say the right things, but if Iran was doing economically well, that would matter a lot. If Iran was like, let's say it was like today's Vietnam, right? But that's not the case, and many other reasons, including the fact that Iran, the Islamic Republic, feels like it's not Iran anymore in many ways. They by which I mean that they don't even claim to love this country. They don't claim to stand for the Iranian nation really so much as their sort of Islamist ideology. So look, 85%, right? I'm saying 85% of Iranians don't like the regime. So of course you'll be hopeful when a revolutionary movement, when sort of there's mass protest. You think that they have a chance of getting somewhere. But what is the problem? The problem is the lack of leadership and organization, right? Now, I was hopeful in September 2022 and after, partially because I thought this is a moment in which we can get our shit together and build a united political opposition that is able to lead the anti-regime movement, overthrow the Islamic Republic, and build a democratic order. But unfortunately, that is where we failed, as we have failed in previous occasions there. There was an attempt that, some people came together, they formed a coalition, it sort of collapsed in a matter of weeks. So, yeah, there was a lot of hope. Overthrowing dictatorships is always difficult, especially when they have such a strong security bodies as the Islamic Republic does. But we would have had a chance if we had been able to put together leadership. But unfortunately, we failed to do that. And for two reasons quickly. In Iran, obviously, it's very hard for, during the 2022-23 movement, the Iranian government arrested like 20,000 people. Very smartly and very, very clearly, right? If you are, let's say you are a popular actor who supports the movement, they arrest you. If you are a teacher, if you are a trade unionist, anyone who could be a potential to play an organizing role was arrested. So in Iran, that's what you do inside Iran, right? And outside Iran, and that's where the real shame is, there were tons of people. We had so much at our, they've had some support from clearly some governments in the world, many governments in the world, in the West, and they don't like Iran, so they were sympathetic. We have all this media to broadcast to Iran and sympathy of much of the Iranian population. But we and all of us failed to do anything with that. And it's basic. If you don't put together a political alternative, how are you going to bring down the regime? Unfortunately, many Iranians, like many others in many different countries in recent years, are miseducated effectively. They seem to believe that you can make political change either by hashtags or by horizontalism or by just, if Angelina Jolie tweeted enough in support of you, somehow the regime would change. Politics has never worked in this way, unfortunately. And Iranians have learned that the hard way. They have paid for their lack of political organization and their lack of putting their differences aside and building a political alternative by the continuation of the Islamic Republic.
These executions that are happening in Iran right now, women being executed, Jewish minorities being executed, is this the regime showing people, trying to kind of reassert the fear that would put down future protest movements and revolutions like we saw in 22?
Much of Iran's Jewish minority has already left the country, but about 10,000 to 20,000, something like that, is continue to remain in Iran, and like other non-Muslims, and in fact, like most of the Iranian population, they're oppressed by the Islamic Republic. Iran, under the Islamic Republic, has one of the highest rates of execution in the world. In fact, it's second to China, not per capita. Generally, second to China, right? So that tells you per capita it rivals China. In fact, effectively, the only reason, because we don't really know China's number, basically. China doesn't really release its execution number. It's a lot, right? So Iran is a big offender there. It has also executed about 4 or 5 people because they took part in the protests. It has now condemned to death Tumaj Salehi, a great Iranian rapper whose brave music in support of the movement in Iran galvanized many people and made him very popular, very courageous man, really, who never, he was tortured so badly, and his forced confessions were aired from the state TV, but he continued standing for what he believes in and making new music, and now they've sentenced him to death. I am hopeful that with the hard work of everybody, including anybody who's listening, I encourage you to Google Tumaj Salehi, see what it is you can do to protest and prevent his execution. So Iran has done that, and yes, even the non-political executions are a way to intimidate society, and it has always been like that. Islamic Republic, by its very high number of executions, wants to show that here's what we can do. We control things, and we know you don't like us, but we'll kill as many of you to keep power. That's been very clear, the game of the Islamic Republic, that is ready to kill as many people, as it takes to hold on to power.
Are you hopeful for the future?
Antonio Gramsci, the Italian theorist, used to say that you should have an optimism of the will and pessimism of the intellect, right? So I am hopeful because I love Iran, and I believe in Iran, and I believe in the Iranian people. And I believe that that's the only way is to be hopeful and to hope that we can have a future. If I look at it very sort of intellect alone, also, there are some hopeful signs. As I've argued recently in an article, I believe that after Ayatollah Khomeini, who is 85 now, after he dies, there is a big chance that even if I don't think there will be democratization by these people that are in charge, but they might relax some of the repressive policies that they have and try to open up Iran more for their own benefits, and that would end up benefiting the Iranian people as well. But if the quest is, we started talking about democracy, right, from 41 to 53, right, and if the goal is a democratic Iran, it's very hard to be hopeful. It's a struggle that I think will continue. First of all, what I want is that, I haven't been back to Iran, of course, as most Iranian dissidents. I cannot go back since 2008. So first, what I want is, even if Iran is not democratic, I want it safe enough for people like me to be able to return and do something there. But beyond that, I am hopeful that one day we can have either a semi-democracy or more democratic institutions, and finally getting there. It's a struggle that will continue, but it's hard to be hopeful about it in the short term, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much. This has been a great conversation. I really appreciate you joining me, and thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you very much. It was a lot of fun. Thank you.